And hello everyone, it is Peter Sam, the Narrow Gauge Engine here, and I am back with another Top 10 video. This time it is the Top 10 Worst Classic Series episodes. Finally, we're back to talking about episodes from the ultimate Thomas and Friends era, even if they are a bit shit. To be honest, this was hard because there's nothing blatantly wrong with some of these episodes, they just seem a bit minimal. Obviously there's the minute few that are actually bad, and we'll get to those, but first I'd like to remind you that these are all my opinions and mine alone. I'm not trying to dictate fact with these, and let's keep it respectful in the comments please. Now let's start with number 10, Daisy. As a Season 2 episode, Daisy has some good use of camera work and editing, but if you look at the other episodes in the season, even those elements feel weak in comparison. There are some episodes like A Close Shave with its POV shots that make its cinematography stand out, but then we have this episode which has one shot that tracks left along Daisy, and that's all I can really recall in terms of important cinematography. Next, let's talk about narrative, because it only serves one function, to introduce us to Daisy. It doesn't really do anything else. I guess you could argue that it begins the dynamic between her and Toby, but we never really get that here. They don't even seem to have a conversation. So because of that, it doesn't really feel like it has a direction, and then when it ends, it just ends. There's no real conclusion or anything, it just sort of stops, and that's it. The one thing that saves it though, the shining star that glimmers through all of these weak elements, is Ringo Starr's narration. His performance as Daisy is entertaining and pretty much perfect. Her snobbish and judgmental personality is highlighted amazingly through his tone, and it is why this episode isn't lower down on the list. Well done Ringo, you helped, at least a little bit. Number 9, Thomas's Train. This is one of those episodes where again it isn't bad, it's just really minimalist in terms of loads of aspects, like the camera work. The music is good, but the bog standard of what you'd come to expect by now, and even the narration isn't absolutely amazing this time. Ringo was still coming into his own, and whilst he was still good, he was nowhere near as good as he was in the previous episode we just spoke about. The narrative itself is also really basic and uninteresting, with Thomas becoming impatient and forgetting to wait to be coupled up to the train before shooting off like a rocket. This episode comes from the same era that had episodes including giant floods, railways in the hills lost to time, so of course an episode that is very bare bones in all of its elements would end up on the list. Although again, I must state I don't think it's bad, I just think it's very not good. It's perfectly neutral and inoffensive. The bare minimum of what you'd expect an episode of Thomas and Friends to be. Number 8, Gordon and the Gremlin. The problem that I have with this episode, and a few of the other Season 5 episodes that made it on this list, is that it kinda just feels dead on the inside. This episode feels like just wacky hijinks for the sake of it, and I think that's shown through the logic it presents. Why does Thomas take Dowager Hat to Gordon just for Gordon to take Dowager Hat back to Thomas later on in the episode? Couldn't Thomas have just done all of this shit? Between that and all of the humour that it at least attempts, there is no method to this episode's madness, which is what other Season 5 episodes succeeded with. There was method there, a clear direction that we were heading in. This didn't have that. Despite a strong opening minute and a nice little lore reveal at the end, those elements didn't save it from getting number 8 on the list. Number 7, James and the Coaches. Another Season 1 episode that isn't all that exciting. This one takes from 2 Railway series stories, James and the Top Hat and James and the Bootlace, and the transition between these two stories, since they're directly correlated, is seamlessly done and probably the best praise I can give this one. It feels like it naturally progresses from one to the other. That's good, and the Bootlace part of the episode is pretty entertaining all things considered. The Top Hat segment was kind of boring and flat for me. As well as this, James just seems to be interacting with the world around him for a large segment of the episode, like talking to Thomas at Elsbridge and remembering his accident in the field as he passes by it. This takes up a good chunk of the episode too, so whilst yes, James definitely does drive the narrative in areas, they're very quick areas, and we end up getting stuck with the dull stuff for most of the watch time. All of this is why it got this high up on the list, but don't worry, there are still some worse episodes out there, and we're going to get to them right now. Number 6, Sir Topham Hatt's Holiday. We're back with another episode that uses multiple plots that thread together, which didn't work before because a 5-minute runtime isn't enough to fully flash out 2 plots. Oh wait, except this time, it's 3 plots we have to deal with. The Tiger Moth plot, the Sodal Maid plot, and the Annie and Clarabelle thing on the side. What's more is that these plots do nothing to benefit the character or the slither of narrative that I can find within the abundance of wacky hijinks offered up to us here. What do they teach us or the characters? I guess the Tiger Moth plot teaches the pilot to fly safer, but then again, he's not even a major character, so it doesn't really affect anyone all that much. Not the audience, and not the characters, considering he's never seen again. Despite that though, I feel there are a few good points that I can mention. The camera work is pretty decent, I love the bird's eye view shot. As well as this, I find the prop work to be excellent here, and the editing within the Sodal maid sequence is pretty good at creating some funny moments, like the reveal that Percy is pushing it on a flatbed in the end. All in all, it's the fundamentals here that mess this one up, and despite some amusing moments here and there, there's not a lot that I can back this one for. Now it's time for the honourable mentions, a segment that addresses the episodes that couldn't even be bad enough to make it into the list. What a shambles. Now you may have noticed that a few seasons have been noticeably absent from the list so far, so I'm going to use this segment to talk about the worst episodes from them. Let's begin with Season 4. Thomas and Stepney is still the weakest episode of my favourite season because of how Thomas is presented. I feel like some of the Season 3 Allcroft written episodes help to benefit my point because having watched Thomas be nice for most of the season and then see him revert back to his more abrasive, egotistical and childish personality in episodes like this is disappointing. He's so unlikable and awful for seemingly no reason, none that I could find anyway. But at least Stepney is one point of this episode that can be enjoyable. He's such a charismatic character and I think he does well to be able to win Thomas over in the end. I think what could have been improved on though is the very dull story. It's really forgettable and when placed within a season like 4, it was always going to do very poorly by comparison. The Season 7 episode that I think deserves a place in this section is Trusty Rusty because it doesn't do anything or explore any new ground with the Rusty and Duncan dynamic. It conforms so much, and apart from a cool bridge collapse, bearing in mind that another narrow gauge episode focuses on a bridge breaking this season, there isn't really anything too crazy to mention. I feel like Duncan and Rusty should have swapped places for this one and have Duncan be in the right for once. It'd make this episode stick out far more and be a nice send-off for the pair in my opinion. Now for Season 3, and obviously it's Thomas Gets Bumped that takes the cake this time. It's boring, it's forgettable, it's underwhelming, and was so close to getting on the list, but in my opinion, Daisy was slightly worse. Just slightly. I don't think anyone can remember what exactly happens within this episode, and that speaks volumes in itself. Let's not even talk about the crash, if you want to call it that. Thomas just derails on a random bit of warped track, and the build-up doesn't even really justify the payoff. Anticlimactic is the word, and this episode is the epitome of it. Anyway, let's move on to some far more terrible episodes with far more terrible elements. Number 5, Better Late Than Never. An episode where everyone acts entitled, and the narrative's message is just plain odd. That's the level, that's where we're at now. Thomas and Bertie are extremely unlikable throughout the entire thing, thinking only about themselves over the safety of their colleagues, which is so fucked up I can barely fathom it. Don't get me wrong, Thomas's savage comments are funny, but when they come from a place of self-entitlement and selfishness, it's hard to truly back him. Something interesting I noticed in this episode too is that this is probably one of the only times James has acted normal and not like a twat, and he just gets shot down by Thomas. I don't know why I feel the need to mention it, I just found it interesting. Now the overall message of this episode is that sometimes being late can be a good thing, but I feel like the episode was structured so badly that it just gets lost in the shuffle, with loads of exposition and setup that the narrative doesn't even feel like it has direction until the second half. Number 4, Thomas and the Rumours. I'm going to be a bit briefer with this one because we've already discussed many of these problems at length, with the whole multi-plot thing and the very artificial feeling I get from it, like with Gordon and the Gremlin. But there are some other aspects that I want to talk about that are specific to this episode, namely how Harold gets mistreated. Now I think Harold's a douche and I've made no effort to cover that up previously, so to have him in an episode where I begin to feel kind of bad for the guy is actually impressive. It's also really bad. Every character just seems to suddenly hate him because he gets one special job. Just because it's not them, they all throw hissy fits and badmouth him whilst he's out of earshot. Never mind the numerous and plentiful specials characters like Gordon and Henry have had over the years, because they want this special, which all in all is a pretty fucking dull one. Taking a bloke around to see some areas to build a playground, and all we see him find is sand for a sandpit. By Jove, the kids have been saved! Speaking of that scene, that crash was a bit terrible, wasn't it? And by a bit, I mean excruciatingly terrible. What an absolute letdown. Gordon just rolls into a tunnel, and then dust. It's not even a good way to leave it to the audience's imagination, considering we're never given any context around this tunnel previously. We don't know what's in there. Let's just move on to the next one, because I can't be arsed for this mess anymore. Number 3, Thomas and the Guard. Already said most of what I have to say on this episode in my Season 1 re-ranked video, so check that out if you want to know my true problem with it. You can also watch the others if you want. Help a boy out. Anyway, apart from Thomas's terribly weak consequences for his actions, I find the intro to this way too long. I get that it's showing the audience what life on Thomas's branch line looks like, but I think as much as we got is taking the piss a little. especially when considering the massive gaps between pieces of narration. Then at the end of the episode, as I've already said, feels abrupt to me. Things don't end naturally, and that just feels very jarring. So for me, the start is weak, the end is weak, and the weird-ass moral aspect of the episode is flawed beyond belief. I get nothing out of this, it's terrible. Number 2, Buffer Bother. Now look, I get it, I so wanted this to be number 1, but having rewatched both, the one that ended up reaching that feat really does deserve it. This episode though, this one sucks too. Filled with that repetitive setup often found in season 6 and 7, as well as Bill and Ben's incessant arguing and another less than impressive crash. My question is, what is there to like here? Well, I'll tell you, and I can't believe I'm saying this, but I found the scene where a pipe falls into Bill's funnel rather amusing, and the ending is actually kinda sweet. Watching the twins reunite at the end is adorable, and it actually feels genuine, unlike with the CGI series where they seem so duplicitous with every utterance. I think the scene that demonstrates this best is when Bill covers Mavis in dust. His apology actually comes across as sincere with no amused smirk underpinning the whole entire thing, which is a staple of the CGI Clay Pit twins. It's just nice to know that they weren't always so awfully unlikable as they become later. Anyway, I bet you're all wondering what number 1 is. Not. So let me reveal all to you now. Number 1, Middle Engine. Not only does this episode give us a repetitive setup, not only does it give us Dickhead James, not only do we get the villains that are never given the proper consequences for the actions they deserve, and not only does Percy get wrongfully punished for something that was not his fault, but this one is just sort of flawed on concept alone. The engine in the middle thing sounds like something a kid would do with his toy trains, and unlike with Wilbur Awdry's Super Rescue, this did not translate it over well at all. It is the fact that Ari and Bert don't get punished that bugs me the most about this episode. What is stopping the Fat Controller from walking over there, throwing a match in their fuel tanks, grabbing some marshmallows and a stick, and watch as he makes the world's most unsafe bonfire? He is the controller, he has to set an example and lead his engines. And these are the same diesels that tried to kill Stepney a season prior, so why is he allowing this? It just comes across as lazy managing on his part. And then he has the audacity to reprimand Percy for Henry's mistake. Granted, Henry didn't realise, and I don't think he's fully to blame really either, but Percy did scream for help, and Henry just left. Like, what is that guy up to? Everyone just acts so weird in this episode, not in terms of inaccurate character, but just in terms of plain old common sense. And that is why this is the worst classic series episode in my opinion. So, let me know your list in the comments below, and if you like this video, help a boy out and tap all of those things below. The like button, the subscribe button, the bell icon, all that shit. Thank you so much for watching. I've been Peter Sam, you've been you, and it's time for me to sacrifice a handle to their claw.